Back to the future kind of experience, because there has been a Space Force, there is a Space Force. This is really nothing new, but there are some activities that are happening within the world that is bringing forth some of this in prominence. So if you look at this from a perspective, for us, we as a nation rely heavily on the domain of space and the capabilities that it brings, from telecommunications, the ability to just watch the Olympics that were happening in Rio. How do you get to see those? And how long are we doing that? How critical is that? The ability to engage across nations, to communicate, to talk, the ability to see. Global finance works on common timing protocol. And where we get common timing protocol around the world is from GPS. All of the other nations use GPS timing in order to be able to do global finance. Walk up to an ATM machine, to be able to do the timing of networks, the ones and zeros that move from your computer through this network, and how those ones and zeros are able to go through all those fiber cables and through the air and through satellites, all happens because of timing protocol. And then just the ability to go find your way to the local gas station in a place that you've never been before, and you just pull up that app for that and say, take me to the gas station. And people rely on that dramatically. Nobody carries an atlas anymore. The ability for missile warning, as we were watching the latest issues that are happening with North Korea, and now then the pulling out perhaps of the current INF treaty for short-range and medium-range ballistic missiles, and what's that mean to us from a warning perspective. And then the ability to actually see anywhere in the world at any time, to at least verify and to be able to get early warning and to get the intelligence that allows us to know who is doing what, when, where, why, how. Is North Korea actually preparing a launch, and can we see that, and when do we know that? Can we hear that? And if somebody is going to do something, we just watched Hurricane Florence, Hurricane Michael. How long were we able to provide early warning to the residents so that we could give them a chance to evacuate and then come back and save lives? And so the weather report and how that all comes from a satellite-based capability. So when you stop and think for just a moment, how critical is the domain of space to our national security, our way of life, and how we are able to put forth our influence in the world? The domain of space has become, in the last 60 years, a very critical entity. So when we think about the last 60 years, that means we have to start thinking about history. And it hasn't been that long when you really think about it. The very first satellite that went up was Sputnik in October 1957. Then you had the United States next up in 1958. But even then, a lot of folks don't understand how technical we got, how quickly, when you started talking about the very first satellite to provide us a capability down here was the ability to do missile warning. And think about the time period. Cuban Missile Crisis, the advent of intercontinental ballistic missiles, and how important that is to us as a nation. The ability to then do communications, the weather, see from space, hear from space. All of this happened very early in our nation's history, very early. And so we take the Cuban Missile Crisis again. We were getting the pictures of the missile sites and the ships coming in at that time, and that allowed us to put forth our national will and try and prevent that whole crisis to start with. And then the advent of space-based navigation coming out. The very first satellite went up in 1978. So we've got a pretty good, strong piece on this, but when you think about this, in 1957, 1958, you now have the Soviet Union and you have the United States in orbit around the world. And what's going on in the world at that time, when you think about the Cold War and the McCarthy era and the things that are happening in the world and what that means to strategic safety and security. And you back up and you say, what are the rules? and there really are no rules. So because it's a new domain, you start thinking about, what does this mean for our national security? If we're already spying from space, if we're already doing protection from early warning for missiles, if we're already doing weather and all of these things, how do we go forward? And so 10 years after the first launch, we have the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, promulgated by the Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space of the UN. It's a very interesting piece because in 1967, if you think about it, what's going on in the domain of space, very timely that we have the first astronaut movie out right now about our first landing on the moon, but you have the whole space race. How much power is being played between the Warsaw Pact and NATO with the domain of space, and what's that mean to us as a nation? How much are we trying to find out who's doing what to whom and where? So you finally come up with this Outer Space Treaty of 1967, and at that time, there's only 5 countries actually have a satellite in space, but 69 countries signed that Outer Space Treaty at that time. Because if you look at the economic impact, the power, the prestige, there's a lot of folks who are very interested in what's going on in that domain. You're seeing the economics. I mean, who doesn't want Velcro and Tang? It's pretty big. And everybody's watching the whole space race and how important it is. And so we start seeing the nations coming together, looking at how do we do this business. So we finally come up with this treaty. Today, there are 130 countries who are part of this treaty. When you start thinking about it, who gets to go up into space? Well, when you get Sputnik goes up, is it the first guy that says, hey, we get to make the rules? Well, how many people play? If you're talking 130 countries, who has access? So when we promulgated this treaty, we based it on the law of international law of the sea. International waters. Who gets to go to international waters? Everybody, as long as you're not in the 12-mile littoral sector. So if you think about that, who gets to go in air? Well, that depends. Whose country are you over? But in that case, you can actually fly and maneuver, so you won't go over somebody's ground. You don't go into their airspace. The trouble with satellites is they do not fly. Their momentum is based upon speed gained from a launch, and then they are above the force of friction of air. They are just in, well, Newton's first law of motion. Body in motion is going to stay in motion, and it does. However, the universal gravitational attraction of both of those bodies starts making them fall. And so, ergo, satellites do not fly. They fall. And so when you have a satellite just falling around the Earth, and Sputnik is going to go over the United States, we, the United States, can't turn to Russia and say, do not let that satellite orbit over my country. They can't do this. Pardon my language, but Star Wars is crap. Just live with it. Just take it for the outer space, good guys, bad guys, and Western that it is in space. Because all of this stuff doesn't happen. That's aerodynamics in an astrodynamic environment. It just doesn't work. However, we then have to start considering you have a satellite in orbit going over countries. And so they kind of look at that as international waters. Where can you go in international waters? Anywhere. Who can go out in international waters? Anybody. We do flagships. So when we put up a satellite, you still have to say, I'm putting up a satellite, and I'm going to register it with the Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space and the Outer Space Agency of the UN that's headquartered in Vienna. And so when we put it up, we register it. I don't have to tell you what it's going to do. I just have to tell you it's there. It's kind of like you're going to go on a cruise with Norwegian Cruise Lines. Well, the ship may not have ever been in Norway. It's still a Norwegian ship. And so with that, you figure space can go for everybody. And because it's the UN, it ought to be for peaceful purposes, non-aggressive, non-hostile. However, shouldn't the air be peaceful, non-aggressive, non-hostile? Shouldn't the waters be non-aggressive, non-hostile? Pick a world war. Pick most any war. Is the water actually peaceful, non-hostile when you're in international waters? And this starts to see the beginning of the thought process of, do we need a space force? And what does that mean? How do you protect these things? Even though it says it is for peaceful purposes, everybody gets to do it, out of all the folks up there, how many are up there? Who is up there? What are their intentions? How do they do business? And so we as a nation have to start looking at that and what's that mean? Because we are interested in a safe, stable, secure space environment because of how critical it is to our economic and strategic well-being. We understand that it is for peaceful purposes, everybody has the right to use it, but who out of that are responsible parties that also think the same way? And are they going to try and take an advantage? And so we have to be ready to defend ours and our allies' systems in order to be able to do the business we do here on the ground. So this really is a multi-domain kind of look, because the things we do down here are affected by everything that's up there in the outer space and in the space domain. So we actually have space policy, but we have to understand, out of those 130 countries that are signed to the Outer Space Treaty, there are actually currently today 72 that have a satellite in space. Think about that for a second. 72 countries. Who are your friends? Who are not your friends? Is everybody maybe a frenemy? Today, somebody you may be working with, you may not be working with tomorrow. And if we are going to be doing business somewhere in the world, how are they going to impact and affect what we're trying to do and put forth our national strategy and our national will? So it becomes a very contested environment. And out of those 72 countries, there's probably currently somewhere just over 1,800 working satellites. Of those satellites, the United States has about a little over 600 of those. But who has what satellites? What type of capability are they? What are they doing? Are they spying on me? Are they trying to do navigation? Are they doing communications? And if we are reliant on that capability, are they putting up satellites that are trying to deny us those capabilities? Where are they? What are they? And then you start thinking about the amount of money that takes and what happens in space. And here in 2007, we see a major jump in the amount of things we're tracking. So in 2007, China, on their fourth attempt from a mobile launcher, does a direct ascent and shoots down one of their own satellites. Now, one would say that's pretty aggressive. That's probably not very peaceful. That's probably not the nice use of space. Now, understand, we first did it in 1986 from the belly of an F-15. And we saw the results of that and saw all of the junk that we took from one big satellite and turned into thousands of pieces of little satellite, and a lot of it's still in orbit around the Earth. You say, what's the effect of that? How safe and stable a secure environment do you have to be able to put up other satellites that you want to use if they're going to be hit by pieces of other satellites and destroy them? The interesting piece to this is, why did China do this in January of 2007? I would say that that is a very strong message they're sending to the United States. However, note that in October of 2006, the President of the United States, George W. Bush, published his national space policy. And in that policy basically stated, we, the United States, reserve the right to deny anybody the capability to use space in order to protect our national sovereignty, which I would tell you is a pretty strong message. Now you're seeing the domain of space as a vehicle to put forth our power through information. China, on the other hand, turns around and says, watch this. So now the question remains, is it illegal to shoot down your own satellite? Absolutely not. But if you just take for a moment and be the Indo-PACOM commander in January 2007 and understand that you are the #1 priority of the United States, the Indo-Pacific Rim, and China has just shot down a satellite. How do you feel? And what does that mean? Do I now have another nation holding my space capabilities hostage? And what's that mean to us as a nation as we depend so much for telecommunications and navigation and timing and intelligence and early warning and weather and all that comes from a space-based capability? And now China has shot down a satellite. Let's also turn around and say 13 months later, we shot down a satellite, but in this case, that satellite was deorbiting, and because of the amount of hydrazine fuel on it, if it landed in a populated area, a lot of people would die. And therefore, the rest of the world could turn around and say, oh, the United States is deploying weapons of mass destruction from space, which is a violation of the Outer Space Treaty. You can't have weapons of mass destruction in space. What it doesn't say is, it doesn't say you can't have a weapon in space. Think about that. So in that case, we do a little bit of software modification, take about 10 days, we engage our satellite as it's coming in at a very low altitude very quickly, and we engage it and destroy it on the first shot. Matter of fact, it's really interesting, if you get to see the video, the seeker hits the aim point on the gas tank within 10 centimeters. But now you start seeing the strategic play and what's going back and forth. Who's holding who hostage in space, and what are the capabilities that we need to maintain, and what's that mean to us as a nation? Are we going to be able to use our capabilities worldwide if a country can therefore attack in space? So we start thinking about who is the threat? Who is what we perceive to be our threat? Let me put it that way. Because words are weapons. I don't want to say they're a threat. But we have the perception that if somebody is going to try and deny us the capability to use the space domain, who might that be? We start seeing the capabilities that we saw China do a direct descent anti-satellite. We do see them with lasers on the ground, and they are dazzling the optics of our ISR satellites, so they're blinding them temporarily. We do see a very large capability in electronic warfare developed by other countries that we are interested in. Particularly Russia, China have brigades of electronic attack systems. If I talk to my ground force folks here, what do you have? I'll get crickets. Yeah, you haven't got anything. So we start seeing the effect back and forth of what's this mean to us in our ability and who are we dealing with. Even today, you can find in open source, what about co-orbital? Russia has a satellite right now out there by our telecommunications satellites, 22,300 miles, well, wherever south is, that way towards the equator. And so they have, it is actually, think about this, you are now my geosynchronous belt, and now you take this satellite and I'm just going to move along geosynchronous belt, and here I am, I'm next to your satellite. What are you doing? What is that satellite doing? Am I collecting the energy that's coming up and listening to the signals? What happens if I just take a little robotic arm and do a little push and nudge? Can you now use that satellite? What happens if, when we have those kind of capabilities out there, and Russia isn't even the number 2 anymore? China is. And now we start seeing the trade wars. You see what's happening down in the South China Sea, and how much of an adversarial relationship is happening in that area of the world. What's happening, what we saw happen in the Ukraine and the Crimea, might that be happening up in the Baltics? I don't know. But how much are we going to need our capabilities to put forth our will and our allies to help protect and serve within those areas? And how much do we need the domain of space in order to be able to do that? So as we look at the threat, the question then comes is who's doing something about that? Who's in charge? Who is taking care of the security of the space domain? And what type of force do we have as a nation? I mean, I have a Navy. I can take care of the waters. I have an Air Force. I can take care of the air. I have an Army. I can take care of the land. I now have a cyber command. I can take care of my ones and zeros. Who takes care of space? That becomes an issue. So we have to start thinking about what are our dependencies? How much do we need those capabilities, and what are the country's intentions? And how's the fastest way that affect us? And we know the enemy, that's a quote unquote, because who's the enemy? Well, today, yesterday, tomorrow, every day is different. But you look at, if they can deny our space systems, what are we doing about that? How will my intelligence agencies, how will my Department of Defense, how will my Department of Commerce and our ability to do trade be able to do our business if we lose the space capability? So these are the things we have to think about, and then it goes to who's in charge of this domain. So as we look at the news today, what we are seeing and what we're hearing is we need a space force. We need a space force. We want to defeat adversary space and counter space threats if necessary, maintain our commercial industry, because the commercial industry is critical. We make a lot of money in our country based upon commercial space. I mean, just look around the room. I bet a lot of people have SiriusXM or DirecTV or some other means that they're using a space-based capability, and we have to maintain and extend our presence in exploration. You've probably been reading the news. We just had a major impact trying to go to the International Space Station. We lost our ability to send humans into space in 2011 when we stopped the shuttle program. But the International Space Station still goes on. We taxi through Russia. Well, that's a dependency. I can't get to the International Space Station without Russia. So if I get into full-blown, adversarial relationship with that country, how do we get people to the International Space Station? We're looking at that. Those are the things we have to think about. So we need to maintain our leadership and premier standing. So today, we hear this talk about the Space Force. Well, I go back to the initial statement I made. Ladies and gentlemen, we have had Space Forces for a long time. We have. Go back to 1985, we established U.S. Space Command. We had a U.S. Space Command. That Space Command went all the way through to 2002 when the Unified Command Plan was changed after 9/11 in 2001. Because we found with the advent of 9/11, who was taking care of North America? Nobody. So they needed to establish a NORTHCOM. I mean, we had EUCOM, we had AFRICOM, we had PACOM, you had SOUTHCOM. We had the world covered, except where we live. So in order to be able to maintain our security, we established a NORTHCOM. With that, we saw the advent that space was kind of important, but not as important at that. So they took the mission and moved it over to Strategic Command. So Strategic Command, in charge of the nukes, in charge of global strike, in charge of global ISR, in charge of cyber at that time, in charge of all sorts of things. This was just another added mission within their set. And so when you have a whole lot of missions, there isn't a lot of focus on any one of them. So in 2000, the National Defense Authorization Act established the Commission to assess the United States National Security Space Management Organization. You know what? That sounds an awful like the exact same words that were used in 2017. What I would like to do is just take a moment to read, and I hate to do this, but I think it's important, because I want you to make the connection from then, 2000, to now, of what you are hearing is going on in the news and in the Space Force. So this report by the Commission of Management of Outer Space says, this report provides the Commission's assessment of the organization and management of space activities in support of U.S. national security. The Commission has unanimously concluded that organizational and management changes are needed for the following reasons. Sounds a lot familiar with what we're doing today. First, the present extent of U.S. dependence on space, The rapid pace at which this dependence is increasing and the vulnerabilities it creates all demand that U.S. national security space interests be recognized as a top national security priority. Back to the future. Second, the U.S. government, in particular the Department of Defense and the intelligence community, is not yet arranged or focused to meet the national space needs of the 21st century. Third, U.S. national security space programs are vital to peace and stability, and the two officials primarily responsible and accountable for those programs are the Secretary of Defense and the Director of Central Intelligence. Fourth, we know from history that every medium, air, land, and sea, has seen conflict. Reality indicates that space will be no different. And finally, investment in science and technology resources, not just facility, people, is essential to the U.S. to remain a leading spacefaring nation. So I postulate to you, what we're doing today is nothing new. These words are exactly what you're hearing today coming out of our current administration. Why is space so important? Because we're so dependent on it. And who is the threat and what are they doing? So we see where it is, and so what I would like to do is to tell you that in 2017 they published the National Defense Authorization Act. And in that act, Congress said, Department of Defense, you will establish a sub-unified command of U.S. Space Command. The commander of Air Force Space Command will be the dual-hatted person for this sub-unified command for the first go-around. After that, it will be a separate individual. Air Force Space Command has its commander, U.S. Space Command will have its other. That is what they said it will do. I want you to be able to give me a report on where we're going to go to establish a Space Force. Tell me by March. The Department of Defense published a document and said, this is our plan. We are going to establish the sub-unified command, followed by unified command, and then establish a Department of Space. And then the interim report came out in August. August 9th is when it came out. And it basically outlined the same thing. And it says, final report in December, but they say we are going to stand up U.S. Space Command, sub-unified command on December 10th. So we are less than 2 months away. What we saw in August was from the current NDAA directive is that you will establish the sub-unified command. We're going to change Title 10 USC. So it is now an act. It's law. So Congress says you are going to establish the sub-unified command. In August of 2018, the Department of Defense published a document, and then in September of this year, just last month, the Secretary of the Air Force wrote its proposal and said, you know, got it, like it, okay, the heck with this sub-unified command thing. We're going straight to a functional combatant command, its own unified command. Welcome back to the future. We are going back to U.S. Space Command. We're going to have a U.S. Space Command. I'm not going to go sub-unified. It's going to be an equivalent to Southcom, CENTCOM, Transcom. We're going to have a unified combatant command functionally for space. Again, that's what we're going to do. Oh, and by the way, we're going to establish a Space Force by 2020. That means we're going to, 70 years since we've established the Air Force. So now you're going to see in 2020, we are going to establish a Department of Space Forces with all the changes in the titles to be stood up in 2021. If you note the date, yesterday, the National Space Council met for this specific purpose. And so today, based upon understanding we have a threat to our national security in the domain of space, and that all agencies, Department of Defense, Intel community, our transportation, our USAID, all of them have a dependence on space. So they are going to create a new U.S. Space Command, and that supposedly is going to happen on December 10th. I'm not holding my breath, but that's the idea. It is not what Congress said that they would resource, but the Department of Defense has said they have the proposal going through to the president now to change the Unified Command Plan in time to be able to make this happen. You're going to create a joint space development agency because lately the capabilities we have not been keeping up with technology, and we need to be much faster in how we acquire and employ technology from space to have the advantages that we're looking for. Provide the authorities in order to be able to engage the threat in space if necessary to maintain our presence and our capabilities. Direct creation of legislative proposal to go to Congress, so Congress will actually put in National Defense Authorization Act the establishment of the Department of Space and the force that it creates. So as we see, as we go forward, we as a nation rely on space. We don't think about it. We don't. We just use it. We don't think about when we turn on that app and navigate to wherever we're going, you think that all those pieces of parts. You don't think about when you walk up with a credit card and swipe it to get your Happy Meal. That's all enabled by space-based capabilities. We don't think about the telecommunications and how you can actually see what's going on in the world within minutes, and the missile warning that happens and how critical space is to our nation. It's vital national interests. Students today in the classrooms are talking about centers of gravity, and they're talking about unified action. And as you do the analysis of what are the ways, means, and ends, what are the critical resources and the critical vulnerabilities, what's the critical capabilities that allow us to do business as a Department of Defense, but then again as a nation for intelligence and for just survival, what's that mean to us, and how do we think about space, how critical and vulnerable is it, and if it's so vital, who's taking care of it? And so we see that domain enabled by international treaties, big vulnerabilities, and there are other folks out there understanding how vital it is and are interested in those capabilities as well. And so what does that mean for us as we deal with them, and how do we protect our interests in the global commons? With that, we see this administration understanding the criticality of the domain of space, what it means to us, how we as warfighters need to understand that domain, that it's not just about trains, planes, and automobiles, because those trains, planes, and automobiles don't work in the contemporary operating environment of today's military issues without a space-based capability. And so with that, as a nation, we have to understand what's important to us. So with that, I thank you for the opportunity to speak to you. I am happy to stay here and entertain questions that you might have with regard to the Space Force and space criticality to our nation. Rocking. I got it all. Then with it, yes, sir.
No one bites, I'll bite. So this is the microphone, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
Jump in this pond.
Okay. As much as you can tell us, have we addressed the possibility of cheating on the UN treaties? For example, maybe a nation has launched a satellite with another satellite in there too that they haven't reported, or maybe, I know weapons of mass destruction aren't allowed, but perhaps they launch a tungsten rod that they could deorbit into a city or something like that.
Boy, we were looking at that. We called it rods from God.
Right.
Yeah, we were going to deploy rods from God. 20-meter long tungsten rods, GPS guided, and when the satellite goes overhead, drop that puppy, boom. You know how cheap it is to do it with the B-2?
Fair enough.
Yeah. Other weapons from space to the ground. Yeah, big bucks, no whammies. And then there's law. And I'm not talking about man's law, I'm talking the laws of physics. You're not going to get lasers from space. You're not going to get particle beam generators, things like that. However, satellites going up that may have other clandestine satellites attached to them. Yes. Yes. In open source, they've even discussed that. Yes, that is possible, and it has been seen and has been done. In open source was the Russians launched satellite, and every time you launch, there's a debris field of some sort. There's fairing shrouds, there's other upper stage body rockets, things like that. And the fortunate piece is we as the United States have the best and really good space situational awareness capability. We have radars, we have telescopes, we have satellites in space. We know really well what's up there, and if something seems a little hinky, we go and really look at it. And so in this case, we, for years, were tracking this piece of debris. All of a sudden it moved. It's like, what? And so now, is it possible? Yes. Even more probable with the advent of how much is up there. I mean, just in April of 2017, a company called Planet, LLC, launched 104 satellites in one launch from an Indian rocket in low Earth orbit because they're putting up a constellation of satellite imaging satellites that look at the world 24/7. It's going to be a whole network of satellites. There's a company out there about doing worldwide Wi-Fi off of 1,000 satellites around the globe all the time. And when you start looking, it's not quite Wall-E, but there's a lot of stuff up there. And so is it possible for somebody to do something that isn't quite within the spirit of the treaty? Absolutely. 100%. Ergo, why this believes we need a Space Force, because we have to be ready for that eventuality. In our own defense, we promulgate we would not be offensive in space. We won't. But we certainly have to be defensive. We have to be able to protect our capabilities. It's a great question. I hope, did I answer? Yeah. Okay. Great. Yes, sir.
So you actually introduced the topic I was wondering about, which is low or nano constellations.
Sure.
How does the advent of satellites and the ability to do these kind of constellations, does that change at all? Or is it kind of more of the same?
Because you see the advent of so much small satellites. So the question really relates to normally, you put up a satellite, it's about as tall as this ceiling and probably about 8 feet wide, 8 feet deep, and it's a big thing, and it's got power, and it's got fuel, it's got solar panels and all that other stuff. Well, now we're putting up satellites that are 1/8 the size of the podium I'm standing next to. So the advent of that is when you start thinking about how do I protect my systems? How do I protect my capabilities? If I have one big satellite, that's really easy to be targeted. What if I put up a cluster of 5 or 6 small satellites that communicate with each other, that give you the capability? Then how do you target that? Much harder, much more difficult. And if you put up a large constellation, if you negate 1 or 2 satellites, you still got another 100 to deal with. So ergo, that is a thought process going forward. It's a lot cheaper to put up small satellites, but then again, you end up with a whole bunch more satellites that somebody's got to command control. The congestion in space is not necessarily the stuff, it's the frequencies. Each satellite needs to have a link up and a link down. And if you think about a communication satellite, if I'm the controller, if the light above me is the satellite and you're all the users, I need my up and down link, and every one of you needs your own set down link. Now multiply that across a country, across a theater, across the earth. That's where the congestion is coming, is in the frequencies, not necessarily the number of satellites. Does that help answer?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Help me envision something here. Whenever I think of a military leadership structure, the tank, for example.
Sure.
I photograph will have the chairman and then the 4 service chiefs, or the chairman and the 4 service chiefs, and when necessary, the commandant of the Coast Guard. What does this new creation, that photograph will look like now?
So now you will have a service chief for the Army, for the Navy, for the Air Force, for the space, because it'll be a Department of Space Forces.
Okay.
So it is going to be another service.
Okay, yeah, all right, got it.
That then leads the advent to the discussion. So if the space service is up, do we still maintain a space command, the fighting commander of space, and then the Department of Space is a service provider? That hasn't been worked out yet. This only came out yesterday, so there's still a lot of distance we need to go to really work out the kinks. But in reading the Secretary of Air Force's proposal that she published in September, and has since amended, at that time, this really interesting thing said, yeah, we're going to subsume the NRO, the National Reconnaissance Office. We're going to subsume this, we're going to subsume everything else, and all of a sudden, it was a lot real fast, and said, no, 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 no. But there are going to be some really interesting coordination points that need to be made to make this work, and so we will look, as we look forward, as we establish a space service, which honestly, on a personal, I don't know if I'm going to be retiring from the Department of the Army or the Department of Space. That's going to be interesting in itself, so there's a note there. But we will have to see how this works and what are the command and control links, but it will be a service. And with that, they're going to have to be the service component to all those geographic combatant commanders as well. Is there anything else? Yes, sir.
I read an article that said within the next 5 years or so, there will be not just the International Space Station Forum brought into this, but at least 3, the Chinese and maybe a commercial, and going forward, then even more.
Yeah.
How does that all fit into this picture that you're giving us in addition to the nano satellites?
Well, the interesting piece is that space is open for everybody. You can't tell them not to go there. We tried to tell North Korea they couldn't go there, but that didn't work. I mean, we've had a Mir, we'd have a Skylab, the current International Space Station, which is also here. China has already up there for a space station. I'm going to take you even one further, sir. The discussion that I just read about today is the advent of going back to the moon.
Right.
And establishing presence on, you can't own, but you could still go presence, military operations up there, but scientific and how is that in order for us to be able then to allows us to then go to Mars, which is also in the future. But it's an interesting question because you can't tell somebody, no, you don't go to put up a space station. If they have the will, if they have the finance, if they have, all of those things. Yeah, we have high schools in this country that put up satellites. But they build them, and they put them on, and they're commanding and controlling those satellites. Great experimentation, it's great learning. The Air Force does it, West Point does it. So yes, it's a very interesting piece. One thing in discussion within the space communities is that the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 is probably needs to be redone because the whole domain of space 67 was nation state. Today, it's very commercial. Commercial, if whoever's launching for that, the country is responsible for the commercial entities that are putting up those satellites. So back to my Norwegian cruise line example. That cruise liner is still flagged under Norway. Norway is still responsible for it. Even if it's burning, I don't know, Miami, it's still Norway is still responsible. So we're still responsible. So if Iridium, an American company, puts up a satellite, launches it, we're still responsible as the nation that's in there. And there are many changes that are happening, presidential directives. There are 3 space presidential directives. This 4th one is probably going to do everything we just did. So there probably is change in the treaty. We'll wait and see. We'll see how we can determine what they need to do. Yes, sir. Sir, thank you for the opportunity to be here. I appreciate it. I hope and at least gave you something to think about in the realm of space, but what it means to us as a nation, to the Department of Defense, but all the agencies and our security as we go. Have a great day. Thanks, boss.
I'll just remind you again, our next rally, they're on table 14 November, right here, cyber deterrence. Thank you.